I wanted to ground this in the particular now so that you guys can get, that's the abstract framework of it. And I'll just talk about now briefly before I wrap up one particular example of this in my world religions class. So when I started the Wabash workshops last year, they asked us about, surprise, surprise, what is a particular teaching moment where it didn't work out the way you had planned? Okay, I have to focus on one? Okay, let me think. All right, so I focused on one in particular, and that was in my world religions class in my first semester. I had an assignment called Class Discussion Leader Assignment. And the rationale is I love collaborative learning. I love when students take responsibility for the material themselves. And so they were given the task to present on a topic of their choice within the parameters of world religion, and in particular, the topic for that day. So for example, in the class on Islam, one student presented a presentation on hijab as a fashion statement. I thought it was a great presentation. Another, presented on participation in Ramadan, and they're Christian, but they had a friend who was a Muslim, and their participation in that. So, it was great. The students, led a 5-minute presentation. They got PowerPoints together, and I enjoyed it. It's not that I didn't enjoy it, but when I really reflected on it, that did not meet the whole idea of what I wanted to do with this assignment, which was for them to lead a class discussion. Instead, they were standing up, they were really owning the material and presenting on the material, but they weren't getting the class participating in that moment. So I felt unfulfilled because I wanted them to reach this goal of learning how to communicate with each other, which is something that I feel like the students these days really need work on, asking those open-ended communicative types of questions. So I felt this was a good example of this misfit between what I had intended to teach and what the outcome actually was at the end of the semester. Okay. So I sat back and I presented this moment to my colleagues at the Wabash Center. And then they asked me simple questions, such as, well, what's the purpose? What was the objective of this exercise for you? And then I explained what I just explained to you. But at that moment, before that time, I didn't actually realize what my objective was, right? I didn't realize that my overall objective was really to get them to communicate with each other. Rather, I was getting them to focus on something different. So I had to tweak the assignment. But I realized I didn't have to throw away the assignment because actually, at the end of the semester, I was thinking, oh man, that class discussion leader exercise, maybe I just need to nick it, right? But I was like, no, I kind of like it, but that was the thought that went through my head. And then at the end of these discussions, other colleagues at the Wabash workshop shared their techniques for doing similar exercises as the class discussion leader. And two things really became clear to me after these conversations, and also reading a little bit more on the importance of modeling good teaching practices, especially when it comes to classroom presentations. And so basically what I did is I narrowed down the assignment. So instead of them being able to present on anything within that topic, I said it's a news project now, so religion in the news. And they have to draw from one of these 5 approved websites, and then just a quick, and we make that link available so that everyone in the class can read it before coming to class. And also then they come up with a quick summary of that, and then the main focus is on these open-ended discussion questions. And I work with them at the beginning, modeling what an open-ended question is at the very, very beginning of this. So, how, why, and lifting it up out of the context and making it broader. And so it's this process of identifying that a moment that I felt, this kind of effective investment in what was going on, and then reflecting on it, moving it back, and then just kind of slightly making these incremental changes to my teaching practices. And I'm doing that this semester, and I feel like it's going much better.
So I'm going to look at approaches to the academic study of Islam, but also religion in general. I'll be drawing on both my teaching in Islam as a discipline, which often carries particular controversy in recent history, and then also just generally religion in the academic context can be controversial. So I want to look at both of these. But one of the things that I have to do early in the semester, really the first day of class, and repeatedly probably for about the first 2 weeks of class, there's some mention in every class of our methodology. And I remember going to particularly graduate school master's level, but also in undergraduate classes, when professors would do this, I didn't understand why they were doing it. Then I read a lot of medieval Islamic philosophical texts that love to expound methodology very carefully before they tell you anything of interest. And I wanted to find some sort of middle ground. And so one of the things I realized is what I'm really trying to do is help students find the questions that they don't really know that they're asking yet. And also find that point of contact with the study of religion that they may not yet identify. One of the distinctive things about teaching religion is that many people will come in the door with their mind made up about religion in some sense. They're for it, against it generally. They're for one particular strand, but not the others. They're for one particular radical interpretation of a tradition. All sorts of different elements will inform the students' prehistory before they come into the class, and oftentimes that history will, in a sense, shape the questions that they bring and the expectations of what sorts of questions should be answered in an academic class. So I had to work for some time with my first lectures. I just asked people, what is religion? We're studying in this class. What is this? Or I'll start more generally in the Islam class, what is religion, and then move it to what makes Islam distinctive from other religions. But really going at the big concept of what is this category that we study interdisciplinarily. This is the first or second day of class. No one really wants to speak out loud, or those two or three who do want to speak out loud are going to establish that they're the speakers and everyone else will be quiet. So I need to divide them into groups. They talk and they answer this question, but they don't need to come in as the student who says, I'm not very religious. Or the student who comes in and says, when you ask them to introduce themselves to their companion, they say, this is my name and I am Christian or Buddhist or Muslim. Whatever these identities are, for some people they're deeply held in terms of the identification of their self with a particular tradition, and for others not at all, and that can often create a gulf of communication that they're so habituated to. We have to give them space to practice that idea not only with religion but with other identities. My go-to analogy that has developed from personal reflection and deployment again and again is just Americanness, looking at the Constitution as a sacred text in a sense to Americans. It's the text we agree to disagree about. And looking at Americans as an interpretive community that agree to disagree about this text. In a sense, it's authoritative, but not because we all agree on what it means. And this is very parallel, I think, to many religious traditions. You'll have sacred, authoritative texts and interpretive communities. My wife is a physicist, and people do not walk into her classroom typically convinced that they know what they should think about physics. Where they do come into my classroom, so there's a very different dynamic. But another thing that's very different is the field is very conscious of what's effective in terms of pedagogy. There's a whole field of physics education, and it's very carefully and empirically tested what works in the classroom, what doesn't. There's a very conscientious engagement with that, and so I'm really pleased to see institutions like Wabash Center, and American Academy of Religion has long provided a platform for this, but more sort of personal interactive. You can go to their syllabus site and things like this. But to see more conscious reflection on this, I think, is really valuable.
You have to restate propositions that students make a lot.
Yeah.
Because they're coming at it from an aggressive point of view or without the knowledge that they haven't gotten yet. So you have to sort of say, what you mean to say is, or you really want to approach that a different way. I think more so than in a class where you might be talking about 18th century literature, where you won't have someone who comes in, well, Bronte was right and that's the way it should have been done. And, you know, I particularly get, I don't know how much you guys get this, in my Christianity classes, I have a lot of different types of Christians. So whereas Scott might have a Shia and a Sunni and maybe somebody else, I have a Mormon arguing with, well, you said it, a Pentecostal, and Catholics. Catholics were, this semester, very verbal for the first time in my classes, and which is a great thing, but they're also sometimes defensive about the way they're perceived. Mormons, of course, are especially sensitive about the way they're perceived. I have not had a Scientologist yet. But one of the things that the Academy at this point does that it didn't do 30 years ago when I was training is cover some topics that are of more interest to younger people. I certainly didn't learn the sexy stuff that I teach. the more interesting stuff. Child sacrifice. They would never talk about that in my Judaism class 20, 30 years ago. And anthropologically, we're just finding much more interesting stuff than just learning. Not that there's anything wrong with it, the Four Noble Truths and the 5 Pillars, not learning a list of things, learning, oh, this is actually more relatable to my human experience today than just learning the set of things we are supposed to believe or do.
Yeah, and I find too that this is what they're most suspicious of. Whatever we're sweeping under the rug, that's.
Yeah.
When you bring that out into the light, that's when they sort of perk up and
Yeah.
say, "Oh, that's interesting. I didn't hear that at Sunday school, or I didn't
Right.
hear that at masjid." So.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially when we get into the new religious movements. That's
Yeah.
next.
Yes. Yeah.
They love that.